Bill to require the Secretary of Defense, in awarding a contract for the KCX aerial refueling aircraft program, to consider any unfair competitive advantage that an offeror may possess.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Inslee, and the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Moran, will each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield myself such time as I might consume and ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks on the bill under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered, the gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, we have another great bipartisan success today at the closing day of our Congress, and I want to thank Representatives Larson, Blunt, Tiahrt, Moran, and McDermott in bringing this bipartisan bill to the floor. This bill is the Defense Level Playing Field Act, which will incorporate in standalone legislation an amendment we adopted with huge bipartisan support previously by a vote of 410 to 8 in the Defense Authorization Bill. This bill is very important to bring a level of fairness and competitiveness from a job creation perspective to the tanker contract, which is now one of the largest procurement contracts in American history. A $35 billion contract providing for 179 and ultimately 400 aerial refueling planes, which will replace the Eisenhower-era tankers, which is so critical to our nation's skeleton and backbone of our nation's defense. I note the basic thrust of this bill is to make sure that in our procurement process that we have fairness both to the law and fairness to the American workers who are so successful. In one of the bidders, we hope to be so successful with the Boeing 767 platform, which will be fully capable of continuing the tradition of American provision of the very backbone of our American fleet in providing our tankers. And I want to make 4 points about what this bill will do. Basically, what this bill will do is to require the Defense Department to take into consideration any unfair competitive advantage of any of the bidders in this contract. What basically this bill will do will require that the Pentagon will take into consideration any unfair competitive advantage enjoyed by either of the bidder, Boeing or the Airbus consortium, and that is defined as costs of development, production, or manufacturing that are not fully borne by the offerer of any such contract. Now, obviously, what gave rise to this amendment was the fact that we have found that there are over $5 billion of illegal, unfair competitive advantage that have been enjoyed by one of the contractors, the Airbus consortium. But I want to make 4 points about what our bill does. Number one, our bill basically says that we need a fair competition. We are happy to compete as Americans. We love competition. We're happy to compete, but we need to do it on a level playing field. And this bill is very fair because it says that any unfair competitive advantage of either of the bidders needs to be taken into consideration in this bill. We love competition, but it needs to be fair. Second, this bill is fair to both sides, Boeing and Airbus, America and Europe, because it requires an unfair competitive advantage from either bidder to be taken into consideration. And it is WTO compliant. We are careful to draft the bill with that in mind. Third, this is an enormous contract, and there have been enormous unfair competitive advantages bestowed on one of the bidders, frankly, Airbus here. The $5 billion of illegal subsidies that we have found come out to somewhere between $27 to $5 million an airplane. This is an extraordinarily unfair advantage that one of the bidders have been given, and we need to take that into consideration. Fourth, the job importance of this issue cannot be overstated. It is estimated that 62,000 jobs could hang in the balance if we allow these illegal subsidies not to be remedied in this procurement contract. American workers have built the best airplanes, they're ready to do it, and we're not going to allow tens of thousands of jobs to be lost based on illegal subsidization by our friends in Europe. Now, we have standalone legislation. We look forward to giving the Senate every opportunity to act on this. And with that, I will reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Kansas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, thank you. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise to support the legislation introduced by the gentleman from Washington and appreciate his explanation for what this legislation does. I'm here to encourage my colleagues, both in the House and Senate, to support this legislation to level the playing field in the Air Force tanker competition. This is an unending story, presumably. It has gone on for a long time, but at this stage in the process, we need to make certain that there is fairness. We need fairness for our workers, fairness for American companies, and fairness for the American taxpayer. Earlier this year, the World Trade Organization found that European governments are guilty of providing nearly $6 billion in illegal subsidies to Airbus to develop aircraft. These subsidies can put our American workers at a disadvantage in the world marketplace. Tens of thousands of U.S. aerospace jobs have already been lost overseas. Department of Defense, we risk $35 billion tanker competition with these subsidies. In Wichita, Kansas alone, where the finishing center for the new Boeing tanker will take place, the tanker contract could mean 7,500 jobs. Common sense today tells us that when we are so desperate for employment in the United States, we need to make certain that the competition we are engaged in is based upon fairness. But even with the WTO decision, the Department of Defense has ignored the facts. The Pentagon must not be working against millions of Americans who are looking for work, nor should our own government ask American taxpayers to foot the bill for a European economic stimulus. The Defense Level Playing Field Act tells the Pentagon it can no longer close its eyes to the unfair European subsidies. This bill says that the tanker bidding process must be conducted fairly. Its intent is to require the DoD to take into account the price impact of illegal European subsidies. It makes sure that there's a level playing field so that no bidder, whether it's foreign or domestic, has an unfair competitive advantage. American aerospace workers are ready to support our men and women in uniform with the best tanker, and they must be given the fair opportunity to do so. Please join me in standing up for the American worker and for the U.S. taxpayer by voting favorably for the Defense Level Playing Field Act. And I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Kansas reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I would yield 2 minutes to my friend and colleague, gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney.
The gentleman from Connecticut is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to congratulate Mr. Inslee and his leadership on this measure. In a few short weeks, according to the latest news from the Pentagon, this tanker contract, is expected to be awarded. And I don't think anyone can understate the impact over decades which that final outcome will have on the U.S. economy, particularly our aerospace industrial base. As has been mentioned by prior speakers, the first tranche of contract will be about $35 billion. In total, it's estimated to be about $100 billion just in manufacture. Given the age of the existing tanker plane, the maintenance and repair work is probably another $100 billion if you look at over the lifetime of this plane's existence. So for the American industrial base, the decision which the Pentagon is on the verge of announcing will again have an impact decades hence, and it is extremely important for the American taxpayer that they be given total assurance that this decision is going to be made fairly with the best interests of our country at heart. And if you would just step back and look at other weapons procurement programs, whether it's nuclear submarines, aircraft carriers, the Joint Strike Fighter, the notion that those contracts, those weapons platforms would be awarded to foreign manufacturers who receive subsidies from their governments, it would be just laughable. But for some reason, in this instance, the Department of Defense has just turned a blind eye to the obvious unfairness which this bid process has produced. So again, what this very simple measure seeks to do is to put a big red warning flag up to the Pentagon to say, when this decision is made for the sake of the American taxpayer, subsidies that have been found to be illegal will be taken into account in the final decision. And I urge strong support for this measure. And I yield back.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Kansas is recognized.
I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Kansas reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Connecticut, Mr. Laurel.
The gentlewoman from Connecticut is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I thank the gentleman from Washington, and I rise in support of this bipartisan legislation that will protect American jobs and ensure competitive fairness in the contract bid for the next aerial refueling tanker. In May, the House voted overwhelmingly, 410 to 8, on a similar amendment to the Defense Authorization Bill to require the Pentagon to take into account the illegal subsidies that have distorted this competition from day one. The choice for the next generation tanker contract is clear. We can give the contract to an American company, Boeing, and support an estimated 50,000 plus good, high-skilled jobs across this country. Or we can give the contract to a European company, Airbus, thus creating tens of thousands of jobs in Europe. With unemployment where it is today, this should be a no-brainer. In fact, since the last time this issue was brought to the floor, the WTO made a final ruling in the trade case brought by our government against the European Union. It ruled that billions of dollars in illegal European government launch aid subsidies have been used by Airbus to develop every aircraft it has built. More than $5 billion of these subsidies made it possible for the Airbus to launch the A330 it is offering for the tanker. We need to ensure a fair, open, and transparent tanker competition. Our companies and our workers can compete against any in the world when there is a level playing field. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, ensuring the Pentagon takes into account these illegal Airbus subsidies. We need to provide the best tanker for the Air Force, and we must not send these critical defense manufacturing jobs overseas. I yield about the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Kansas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, once again, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I would yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the distinguished gentleman, and I join my colleagues by admitting that competition is good, and I rise in support of competition. But I also recognize, as a member of the manufacturing caucus, that Americans are ready and clamoring to build. They want to produce and create, and as they do that with their sophisticated technology, they create jobs. And so I believe it is unfair that when there is a competition, that our companies are in fact in our own country at the Pentagon are competing against those companies that are subsidized. So I rise in support of this legislation, H.R. 6540, that does not in any way hamper the ability of the Pentagon to do its work, but it indicates that we can build the KCX aerial refueling aircraft program by a company that we have, in this instance Boeing, who I'm very familiar with, having worked extensively with it in the NASA Human Space Exploration Program. Let us build again. Let us manufacture again. And yes, we will create jobs, but we will create and reinforce the genius of our young people who are being trained and those scientists who have created the top-notch technology. To be on the front lines, men and women who are in the United States military need the best equipment. To be able to create jobs and build manufacturing back in this country, we need to have the competitiveness in an even playing field. No subsidies. Boeing can do it. We need to have the Pentagon recognize that America is back in the saddle again. We're building quality products, and we need to be able to build the KCX aerial refueling aircraft. And I yield back my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Kansas is recognized.
Continue to reserve, Madam Speaker.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I want to put in a good word for my comrade in arms, Todd Tiahrt. He isn't with us right at the moment, but he did great work on this. He's had a great career, as well as Mr. Larson. A couple closing comments. I come from a Boeing family. My uncles, cousins have worked with Boeing products from the 707 to the 737, 727, 747. Now they hope to work on the 767 tanker product. So this is a hometown team issue for me. But it is an international issue as to whether or not we're going to have rules when we compete with our friends across the pond. And we are happy to compete no matter what team we're on. This simply insists that America will follow the rules in a fair competition, and it is the right thing to do. So in that regard, Madam Speaker, I'll note that sometimes the Congress reserves the best in its legislation and the best in its speakers pro tem for the last, and I think that this is the best in both ways. And Madam Speaker, I would have no further requests for time, and I'm prepared to close after my colleague has yielded back his time and continue to reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Kansas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, thank you very much. I appreciate very much the comments that have been made today on the House floor. Economically, there is no more important issue in the state of Kansas than the success, or at least the opportunity to have success in this contract bidding process. It has been a long time that we have been waiting, and I hope the gentleman who spoke earlier that indicated that we are on the verge of a decision is accurate. This would be a great development not only for the people of our state, but for the people of our country if we learned that there are jobs to be created and a manufacturing base to be further developed in the United States. And I very much appreciate the gentleman from Washington's indication that this bill is about a level playing field. It's not about awarding the contract. It's about giving a fairness to the bidding process. And I hope that we have the opportunity that the Senate will also pass this legislation, again on the verge of a decision to once again remind the Department of Defense of their responsibility to the will not only of Congress for a level playing field, but to the rightness of this cause, for the sense of fairness, for the right of justice, and for building the opportunity of job creation in this country not only today, but tomorrow as well. And with that, Madam Speaker, I'd like to yield such time as the gentleman may consume to the gentleman from Florida.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I apologize to the House for being out of breath, but apparently this bill was brought up on the floor without anybody's knowledge at the very last minute. I don't know if it's been discussed, but I sit on the Armed Services Committee, and I'd like to ask my friend from Kansas, if I may, Madam Speaker, has the professional staff on the Armed Services Committee at all given their thoughts on the implication of this bill? I can answer the question. I shouldn't have thrown it to. The answer is no. The answer is no, because it hasn't gone through regular order. This bill is not going through regular order. It's amazing to me that we're bringing something forward today, as you have been saying already, that has great implications to the national security of this country. The Armed Services Committee, the requisite subcommittees, have not had an opportunity to talk about this particular piece of legislation. We heard that this may come up last week. It didn't come up last week. Unfortunately, some of the members who are very involved in this contracting issue had no idea this was coming to the floor today. I speak on their behalf and ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks because
without objection, so ordered.
Some of those very members are on airplanes flying to Washington, trying to come up here to be able to debate this particular piece of legislation. But again, it's business as usual for this House in the waning days of the 111th Congress, that we would bring pieces of legislation forward that impact members all across this country, yet not give them the opportunity to come to the floor in a timely fashion and express their views. I would urge my colleagues to vote against this particular piece of legislation. I yield back to Mr. Moran of Kansas.
Thank the gentleman for his comments. I would point out to the House that an amendment to the defense authorization bill of a similar nature passed the House of Representatives by a vote of 408 to 10. and I would reserve the balance of my time, although I would let the gentleman from Washington know that I have no other speakers and am prepared to close.
The gentleman from Kansas reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, and I just wanted to address Mr. Miller's concern. Wanted to advise him that we have been in discussions for the last several days with the current minority staff on the committee, and we've all been well advised about our intention to bring this in one way or another, either by UC or suspension, to the floor, and we've appreciated their cooperation in doing that. I also want to advise Mr. Miller that this is exactly the same language that we did and vote, including the gentleman from Florida, voted for in its previous incarnation in the Defense Authorization Bill. So I hope that I can say this is a fairly non-controversial issue in the House, and we hope that when the light of public interest is shown on the Senate, that they will act on this as well on behalf of America. And with that, Madam Speaker, I would yield, I would continue to reserve, unless the gentleman has no further speakers.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Kansas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I thank the gentleman from Washington for his comments today, and look forward to this bill passage. I encourage my colleagues to vote for it, and I too would like to recognize the work of my colleague from Kansas, Mr. Tiehart, in his efforts on this topic over a long period of time, and appreciate his leadership on behalf of the people of Kansas on this and many other issues. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Kansas yields back. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The gentleman from Washington yields back all time for debate. Having expired, the question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 6540? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without
Madam
objection,
Speaker,
for what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
I ask for a roll call vote.
Gentleman asked for the yeas and nays.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.